The Mafia boss reveals hidden power in a shy woman. She now dominates attention and becomes the center of conversations. The Mafia boss reveals hidden power in a shy woman. She now dominates attention and becomes the center of conversations. And what happened next? Nobody in that room ever saw coming. Elena Vasquez had spent her entire life trying to disappear. Not in the way people disappear when they run from trouble, but in the way a shadow disappears when a cloud covers the sun. Quietly, without anyone noticing. She was 31 years old, worked as a part-time bookkeeper for a small laundromat in the Bronx, and had not spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences to a stranger in over 4 years. Her apartment was a tiny studio on the 5th floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and simmering garlic. She had no social media accounts. She had no close friends. She had a cat named Dust, because Dust, like Elena, preferred corners and silence. Every morning Elena took the same route to work. She walked with her head slightly bowed, her dark hair falling like curtains around her face, her eyes fixed on the cracked sidewalk as though she were reading a secret language in the concrete. She wore the same rotation of 3 oversized sweaters, not because she couldn't afford more, but because oversized clothing made her feel smaller, invisible, safe. The laundromat was owned by a man named Gerald Fenton, a 63-year-old with a persistent cough and an even more persistent habit of forgetting to pay his taxes. That was where Elena came in. She had a gift for numbers, not the kind of gift that gets you into Harvard or lands you a job on Wall Street, the quiet kind. The kind where you can look at a column of figures and feel almost physically when something is wrong. She had been doing Gerald's books for 3 years, and in that time she had saved him from 2 potential audits simply by catching errors that no one else would have noticed. But no one ever praised Elena for this. Gerald barely spoke to her. He would leave the receipts in a manila envelope on the counter every Monday, and Elena would pick them up, take them home, and return them by Thursday, neatly organized, every number in its place. She was efficient. She was reliable. And she was absolutely, completely forgettable. That was the life Elena had built for herself, a life designed around the single principle that if no one noticed her, no one could hurt her. The reason for this principle lived in her past like a scar that never fully healed. Elena had grown up in a household where volume meant danger. Her father, a man whose name she had trained herself to never say aloud, had been the kind of person who filled every room he entered with tension, not with his fists, though there were times, but with his voice, his disapproval, his ability to make everyone around him feel fundamentally inadequate. Elena's mother had responded to this by becoming louder herself, matching his energy with a sharpness that cut just as deep. And Elena, the youngest of 3 children, had responded the only way she knew how. She went quiet. By the time she was 12, Elena had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. She could sit at a dinner table with 6 people and not be addressed once. She could walk through an entire school day without a single teacher calling on her. It was a survival skill that had calcified into a personality. And by the time she was an adult, she no longer knew if she was quiet because she chose to be, or because she had forgotten how to be anything else. This is important to understand, because what happened to Elena Vasquez did not begin with a sudden burst of courage. It did not begin with a motivational speech or a self-help book or a moment of divine inspiration. It began with a wrong envelope. It was a Tuesday in late October. The air in the Bronx had that particular autumn bite, the kind that makes you hunch your shoulders and walk faster. Elena arrived at the laundromat at her usual time, 7:15 in the morning, before the first customers arrived. Gerald was not there yet. He was rarely there before 9. She went to the counter, expecting to find the usual manila envelope with the week's receipts. There were 2 envelopes. The first was the familiar one, slightly wrinkled with Gerald's blocky handwriting on the front, Elena, books. The second was different. It was thicker, heavier, made of cream-colored paper that felt expensive to the touch. It had no name on it, no writing at all. It was sealed with a small circular sticker that was dark red, almost the color of dried wine. Eleanor's first instinct was to ignore it. It wasn't for her. It was probably something Gerald had left for someone else or something a customer had forgotten. She picked up her own envelope and was about to leave when something stopped her. A feeling she couldn't quite name. Not curiosity exactly, more like recognition. As though some part of her already knew that this envelope was going to matter. She put it down. She picked up her envelope. She walked to the door. Then she walked back and picked up the second envelope. She told herself she would just look inside, just to see if there was a name, so she could tell Gerald who it belonged to. That was the reasonable thing to do. She slid her finger under the seal and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, folded once. She unfolded it and read, "You have been keeping the wrong books. Come to Marchetti's on Arthur Avenue, Thursday, 8 p.m. Ask for the back room. Come alone." There was no signature, no name, no explanation, just those 4 sentences in neat, precise handwriting that looked like it had been done with a fountain pen. Eleanor read it 3 times. Her hands were steady, but something inside her chest was not. She did not know anyone named Marchetti. She had never been to Arthur Avenue after dark, and the phrase, "keeping the wrong books," landed in her stomach like a stone because she understood it immediately. For the past 8 months, Eleanor had noticed irregularities in Gerald's finances, small ones at first, a deposit that didn't match any recorded transaction, an expense listed for equipment that the laundromat didn't own. She had flagged these quietly, in her own notes, in a small blue notebook she kept separate from the official books. She hadn't said anything to Gerald because she wasn't sure what they meant, and because saying something would have required a conversation, and conversations with Gerald were something Elena avoided whenever possible. But she had kept track. Column after column, in her precise handwriting, a shadow ledger that documented every discrepancy, every number that didn't add up, every dollar that seemed to appear from nowhere or vanish into nothing. And now someone knew about it. Eleanor put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her bag. She went home. She sat on her bed with dust in her lap and stared at the wall for a very long time. She should go to the authorities. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But go to them with what? A vague letter with no signature, a collection of minor bookkeeping irregularities that could easily be explained as honest mistakes. She could already imagine the conversation. She would sit across from some board officer, trying to explain a feeling she had about numbers that didn't add up, and the officer would nod politely and file it somewhere it would never be seen again. And then whoever had written that letter would know she had talked. She should ignore it. That was the other option. Pretend she had never opened the envelope. Go back to her routine, continue being invisible. But there was that feeling again, that nameless thing that had made her walk back across the laundromat to pick up the envelope in the first place. It sat in her chest like a low hum, and for the first time, in years it felt more powerful than her fear. Elena Vasquez did not go to the authorities. She did not ignore the letter. On Thursday evening, at 7:45, she put on her least oversized sweater, left dust with an extra bowl of food, and took the bus to Arthur Avenue. For those who don't know, Arthur Avenue is the real Little Italy of New York City, not the tourist version in Manhattan with its checkered tablecloths and overpriced pasta, but the authentic heart of Italian-American culture in the Bronx. It is a street where old men play cards in the back of pork stores, where the smell of fresh bread and roasting peppers fills the air even in winter, and where certain businesses have been run by the same families for generations. Some of those businesses are restaurants, some are bakeries, and some are things that don't have signs on their doors. Marchetti's was a restaurant technically, a narrow storefront with a green awning and a window display of dusty wine bottles. That looked like they hadn't been moved since the 90s. Eleanor stood outside for 3 full minutes before she went in. A bell above the door chimed when she entered. Inside it was warm and dim. Red vinyl booths lined the walls. A counter ran along the left side, behind which a heavy-set woman with silver hair was drying glasses. There were only 4 other people in the restaurant, 2 elderly men sharing a plate of antipasti, and a young couple in the corner booth who were too absorbed in each other to notice anything else. Elena approached the counter. Her voice, when it came out, was barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for the back room." The woman with the silver hair looked at her, not with surprise, not with suspicion, with a kind of calm evaluation, the way a jeweler might look at a stone before deciding whether it was worth cutting. "Through there," the woman said, tilting her head toward a narrow hallway past the kitchen. "Last door on the left." Eleanor walked down the hallway. The kitchen noise fell away. The hallway smelled like olive oil and old wood. She reached the last door on the left. It was closed. She knocked. "Come in." The voice was male, deep, unhurried. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it had never needed to compete with anything. Elena opened the door. The back room was smaller than she expected. A single round table sat in the center, covered with a white cloth. 2 chairs, a bottle of sparkling water, and 2 glasses. On the walls, framed black and white photographs of men she didn't recognize, men with serious eyes and expensive suits from decades past. And at the table sat a man who looked like he had walked out of one of those photographs. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was hard to tell. He had thick silver hair combed back from a broad forehead, a face that was all angles and shadows, and eyes that were so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore a charcoal suit, with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open just enough to reveal a thin gold chain. His hands rested on the table, perfectly still. They were the hands of a man who had done many things with them but no longer needed to. "Sit down, Elena," he said. She sat. Not because she wanted to, but because there was something in his voice that made standing feel inappropriate, like refusing an invitation that had been extended by gravity itself. "My name is Dominic Marchetti," he said, "and I know who you are." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the safest response to any statement that felt dangerous. Dominic studied her for a moment. Then he poured water into both glasses, slid one toward her, and leaned back in his chair. "You're wondering why you're here," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. "You've been working for Gerald Fenton for 3 years. In that time, you've noticed things. Things in the numbers. Things that don't add up. And you've been writing them down in a blue notebook that you keep in the second drawer of your desk at home, underneath a copy of a novel called The House of Mirth." Eleanor's blood went cold, not because he knew about the notebook, but because he knew where she kept it. He knew what book it was under, which meant someone had been in her apartment. "Don't be frightened," Dominic said, and his tone shifted slightly, becoming something that, against all reason, sounded almost gentle. "If I wanted to harm you, I wouldn't have invited you to dinner." "I'm not having dinner," Elena said. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to a stranger in months, and it came out sharp, surprising even herself. Dominic's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "No," he agreed. "You're not. You're listening. And then you're going to make a decision." He folded his hands on the table. "Gerald's laundromat is not just a laundromat. I think you know that by now. It's a place where certain funds are processed, cleaned, if you'll pardon the irony. Gerald does this for people who work for me. He has been doing it for 11 years, and he has been doing it badly for the last 3 because Gerald is getting old and careless, and he drinks more than he used to." Dominic paused, letting this settle. "Your notebook documents every mistake he's made, every discrepancy, every trail he's left that could lead someone with authority to ask uncomfortable questions. You've been more thorough than any professional I could have hired, and you did it without being asked, without being paid, and without telling a single soul." He leaned forward slightly. "That tells me 3 things about you, Elena. You're intelligent, you're discreet, and you pay attention to details that other people miss. Those are rare qualities. Separately, they're valuable. Together, they're extraordinary." Eleanor's hands were in her lap, gripping each other so tightly her knuckles were white. Every instinct she had was telling her to leave, to stand up, walk out of this room, go home, destroy the notebook, and never come back to Arthur Avenue again. but she didn't move. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Dominic reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small leather-bound folder. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were documents, financial statements, spreadsheets, account summaries. Eleanor's eyes moved over them automatically, the way a musician's fingers move over keys. "I want you to do what you've already been doing," Dominic said, "but on a larger scale, and with full knowledge of what you're looking at. You want me to keep your books? I want you to keep my organization's books, every division, every operation, every dollar in, every dollar out. You would answer only to me. You would work from a location I provide, with resources you currently cannot imagine. And in return, you would receive compensation that would make Gerald's envelope look like pocket change." Elena stared at the documents. The numbers swam before her eyes, not because they were complicated, but because her mind was racing so fast that her vision couldn't keep up. "I'm a bookkeeper for a laundromat," she said. "You were a bookkeeper for a laundromat," Dominic corrected. "What you are is something else entirely. You just haven't had the room to find out." He closed the folder and slid it across the table to her. "Take this home. Look at it. You have until Sunday to decide. If you say yes, your life changes. If you say no, you walk away. No consequences, no pressure. Gerald never knows about this conversation, and neither does anyone else." Eleanor looked at the folder. Then she looked at Dominic Marchetti. His dark eyes held hers without blinking, without pressure, without any of the menace she would have expected from a man in his position. What she saw instead was something that confused her even more than the invitation itself. She saw patience, and she saw certainty, as though he already knew what she was going to decide, and was simply waiting for her to arrive at the same conclusion. Elena picked up the folder. She stood. She walked to the door. "Elena." She stopped. "The world is full of loud people who have nothing to say. It's the quiet ones who change everything. Remember that." She walked out of Marchetti's without looking back. She took the bus home. She sat on her bed with the folder open in her lap and dust curled at her feet. And she read every page, every number, every line, until 3 in the morning. And somewhere between the second page and the last, something shifted. Not in the numbers, in her. Because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at all the things she had taught herself to hide, her intelligence, her attention, her relentless precision, and instead of overlooking them, had called them extraordinary. It was terrifying, and it was the most alive she had felt in years. Check if you're already. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one, stories that start with a quiet nobody and end in ways you will never expect, only happen here. Subscribe now, so you never miss what comes next. Elena said yes. She didn't say it on Friday. She didn't say it on Saturday. She said it on Sunday morning at exactly 9:14, standing in a phone booth on the corner of her block because the letter had included a phone number and she didn't own a cell phone. She dialed the number and a woman answered, not the silver-haired woman from the restaurant, but someone younger, with a voice that was brisk and professional. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Marchetti," Elena said. "He's expecting your call. 1 moment." 3 seconds of silence. Then Dominic's voice. "Eleanor." "Yes," she said, just the one word. It came out steady. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock. There will be a car outside your building, black sedan. The driver's name is Thomas. He'll bring you to me." The line went dead. Eleanor hung up the phone. She stood in the phone booth for a moment, watching the Sunday morning traffic of the Bronx. A woman pushing a stroller, a man walking 2 pit bulls, a delivery truck double-parked outside a bodega. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business. And here she was, standing on the edge of something that was anything but ordinary, and the strangest part was that she didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. Monday morning, the black sedan was there at 8:55. The driver, Thomas, was a compact man in his 40s with a shaved head and the kind of posture that suggested military training. He held the rear door open for Elena without a word. She got in. The leather seats were cream-colored and smelled new. There was a bottle of water in the cup holder and a small box of mints on the armrest. They drove south, through the Bronx, across the bridge into Manhattan, and then further south still into the financial district. Thomas parked in an underground garage beneath a glass tower that Elena had walked past 100 times without ever looking up. They took an elevator to the 32nd floor. The doors opened into a reception area that was all marble and soft light, with a single desk at which sat a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of practiced neutrality. "Miss Vasquez," he said, as though he had been expecting her for years. "Mr. Marchetti is in his office. Through those doors." Eleanor walked through the doors. Dominic's office was large but not ostentatious. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor. A massive wooden desk sat near the windows, covered in neatly arranged files. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, and Dominic himself stood by the window, looking out at the water, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered. "Welcome to your new life, Elena," he said. And then he smiled for the first time since she had known him, and it transformed his face entirely, softened it, humanized it, made him look like someone's grandfather, rather than someone who controlled a financial empire that operated in the spaces between legality and shadow. "Let me show you what you'll be working with." What followed was the most overwhelming morning of Elena's life. Dominic led her through a series of rooms on the 32nd floor, each one dedicated to a different aspect of his operations. There was a room filled with filing cabinets that contained records going back 30 years. There was a room with 6 computer terminals, each one connected to different financial systems. There was a conference room with a long table and 12 chairs, and on that table were stacked the financial records of every business Dominic Marchetti controlled: restaurants, construction companies, real estate holdings, import-export firms, and several others whose purposes were less immediately clear. "This is everything," Dominic said, standing at the head of the conference table. "Every number, every account, every transaction. It's been managed by different people over the years, some competent, some less so. What I need is someone who can see the whole picture, not just the individual threads, but the tapestry." He looked at her. "Can you do that?" Eleanor looked at the stacks of files. She looked at the computer terminals visible through the glass wall of the adjacent room. She looked at the sheer volume of information that was being placed in front of her like a mountain she was being asked to climb. And then something happened that she did not expect. The mountain didn't frighten her. It called to her. It was as though every number she had ever worked with, every discrepancy she had ever noticed, every hour she had spent in her tiny apartment with Gerald's receipts and her blue notebook had been training for exactly this moment. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "Good," Dominic said. "You start now." Eleanor Vasquez started now, and for the next 6 weeks she did. Not stop. She arrived at the 32nd floor every morning at 8 and did not leave until 9 or 10 at night. Thomas drove her both ways. She ate meals at her desk, food that appeared without her asking for it, always hot, always good. She spoke to almost no one except Dominic, who checked in with her once a day, always briefly, always with the same calm precision that characterized everything he did. And she worked. She opened every file, examined every record, traced every transaction. She built spreadsheets that connected accounts to businesses to individuals. She identified patterns that no one had seen before, not because they were hidden, but because no one had ever looked at all the data at once. She found errors. She found redundancies. She found 17 separate instances where money had been allocated to projects that didn't exist, which meant it was being siphoned off by someone inside Dominic's organization. She documented everything, not in a blue notebook this time, but in a secure digital system that she designed herself, with multiple layers of encryption that she had taught herself to implement by reading technical manuals during her lunch breaks. By the end of the first month, Eleanor had a complete picture of Dominic Marchetti's financial empire. Every dollar accounted for, every discrepancy identified, every leak traced to its source. She presented her findings to Dominic on a Friday afternoon, in the conference room, with the files, spread across the table like a map of a territory that only she could fully read. Dominic listened without interrupting. He looked at the spreadsheets. He looked at the connections she had drawn. He looked at the list of 17 siphoned accounts and the names associated with each one. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How long did it take you to find all of this?" he asked. 6 weeks. "My previous financial people worked for me for years and never caught half of what you've found." "They weren't looking at the whole picture," Elena said. "They were each looking at their own piece. No one was looking at how the pieces fit together." Dominic nodded slowly. Then he did something that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It was brief, no more than 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, Elena felt something she had not felt since she was a very small child, before her father's voice had taught her to shrink. She felt seen. "You are exactly what I thought you were," Dominic said, "and now it's time for the next step." The next step, as it turned out, was not more spreadsheets. The next step was people. "Numbers are the skeleton," Dominic told her the following Monday, sitting across from her in his office. "But an organization runs on people, and people are where you need to grow." Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Numbers were safe. Numbers were logical. Numbers didn't judge you or make you feel small. People did. "I know what you're thinking," Dominic said. "You're thinking that numbers are your strength and people are your weakness. But you're wrong. Your ability to observe, that instinct that makes you notice when a number is off, works just as well with people. You read rooms the way you read ledgers. You just don't trust what you see." He leaned back in his chair. "Starting this week, you're going to attend every meeting I have. You're not going to speak. You're not going to participate. You're going to sit in the corner and watch. And afterward, you're going to tell me what you saw." This was how Elena Vasquez began her education in the art of reading people. And Dominic Marchetti, whatever else he was a masterful teacher. The first meeting was with 3 of Dominic's business associates, men who ran construction projects throughout the boroughs. Elena sat in a chair by the window, a notebook on her lap, and watched. The men talked about timelines, budgets, permits. They were polished, professional, and completely at ease with Dominic. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Afterward, Dominic asked her what she had noticed. "The man on the left, the one in the blue suit, he's worried about something," Elena said. "He touched his watch 4 times during the meeting, not to check the time. It was a nervous habit. And when you mentioned the budget for the Harlem project, he looked at the man across from him before he looked at you, like he was checking to see if the other man was going to say something." Dominic's eyebrows rose slightly. "What do you think that means?" "I think the 2 of them have an arrangement regarding the Harlem project that you don't know about, something they agreed on before the meeting. The man in the blue suit is uncomfortable with it, but the other one isn't." Dominic stared at her for a long moment. "I've known Frank DeLuca for 20 years, he said quietly, "and I never noticed the watch." From that day forward, Eleanor sat in on every meeting, and every time she saw things that others missed, the slight hesitation before a lie, the way someone's posture changed when a specific topic was raised, the micro-expressions that flashed across a face for less than a second before being replaced by a practiced smile. She didn't just notice these things, she understood them, intuitively, the way she understood numbers. Because human behavior, she was discovering, had patterns too. And patterns were her language. Within 2 months, Dominic began asking her opinion before meetings, not after. What should he watch for? Who was likely to push back? Where the fault lines were? And Eleanor, who had spent her entire life avoiding conversations, found herself engaged in some of the most intense and important conversations imaginable. Something was changing in her, not overnight, and not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide coming in. She was still quiet. She still preferred corners to centers, observation to participation. But the quality of her quietness was different now. It was no longer the silence of someone hiding. It was the silence of someone listening. and there is a world of difference between the two. The people around Dominic began to notice. His associates, his employees, even Thomas the driver, all registered the shift. There was a new person in Dominic's orbit, a slight, dark-haired woman who never raised her voice, but who somehow seemed to be present at every important moment. She didn't command attention in the traditional sense. She didn't walk into rooms with authority or speak with the kind of force that demanded respect. But when she did speak, people listened. Because when Elena Vasquez said something, it was always precise, always relevant, and almost always something no one else had thought of. Who is she? People began to ask. And the answer, depending on who you asked, varied. To the accountants, she was the woman who had reorganized the entire financial structure in 6 weeks. To the associates, she was the one who sat in meetings and saw things that decades of experience had missed. To Dominic, she was something else entirely. "She's the most valuable person in this building," he told his right-hand man, Vincent Caruso, one evening after Elena had left for the day. "And the most dangerous, because she sees everything, Vincent. Everything." Vincent Caruso was a man who had been with Dominic for 30 years. He was tall, lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left in the rain. He did not trust easily, and he did not trust Elena at all. "She's been here 2 months, Dom," Vincent said. 2 months. And you're giving her access to everything, the books, the meetings, the names. What if she's working for someone? She's not. How do you know? Because I've spent 60 years reading people, Vincent, and that woman in there is exactly what she appears to be. Someone who has been invisible her whole life, and who is just now discovering that she doesn't have to be. Vincent was not convinced, and this, Elena would later learn, was the beginning of a problem that would nearly destroy everything, but that was still to come. For now, Elena was in the middle of the most extraordinary transformation of her life, and she was only beginning to understand its dimensions. It was during the 3rd month that Dominic introduced her to the concept of what he called the room. "Every important thing that has ever happened," he told her one afternoon, standing by the window of his office with his back to her, "happened in a room. Treaties are signed in rooms, deals are made in rooms, decisions that affect millions of people are made by a handful of people sitting in a room. And the person who controls the room, not the loudest person, not the most powerful person, but the person who understands the room, that person controls the outcome." He turned to face her. "You already understand rooms better than anyone I've ever met, but understanding a room and controlling a room are 2 different things. Understanding is passive. Control requires action, and action, for you, means speaking." Elena felt the tightening again. "I know," Dominic said, reading her expression with the same precision she brought to reading others. "Speaking is hard for you, not because you don't have anything to say, but because somewhere along the way you learned that your voice didn't matter, that it was safer to be silent, and whoever taught you that and whoever made you believe that your words had no value, they were wrong. They were deeply, profoundly wrong, and it's time to prove it." He sat down across from her. "Here's what we're going to do. Next week I have a meeting with the heads of my 5 primary operations. These are the most important people in my organization. They've never seen you. They don't know who you are. And you're going to walk into that room and present the financial restructuring plan you've been developing." Elena's mouth went dry. "You're going to stand at the head of the table," Dominic continued, "and you're going to show them what you've built. And they are going to listen. Because what you've built is brilliant, Elena. It's the most comprehensive, elegant financial structure I've seen in 40 years in this business. And they need to hear it from you, not from me. From you." "Why?" Elena whispered. "Because if they hear it from me, they'll respect the plan. But if they hear it from you, they'll respect you. And you need them to respect you, because from now on, you're the one they'll be answering to." Elena did not sleep that night, or the next. She lay in her apartment with dust on her chest and rehearsed her presentation in her head over and over until the words were smooth and worn like river stones. She rehearsed in front of the bathroom mirror, watching her own mouth move, trying to make the words sound. confident when everything inside her was screaming that this was a mistake, that she was going to fail, that these powerful, experienced men were going to see right through her and dismiss her like everyone else always had. On the morning of the meeting, she stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes. She didn't own anything that felt right. Her oversized sweaters were armor for invisibility, and this was a day that required the opposite. She ended up wearing a simple black blouse and dark pants. Nothing remarkable, but the closest she had to something that didn't actively try to make her disappear. Thomas drove her to the building. She took the elevator to the 32nd floor. She walked into the conference room. 5 men were already seated around the table. They ranged in age from 40 to 70. They wore expensive watches and tailored jackets. They had the look of people who were used to being the most important person in any room they entered. And when Elena walked, in every single one of them looked at her with the same expression, polite confusion. Who was this small, quiet woman, and what was she doing here? Dominic was already at the head of the table. He stood when Elena entered. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is Elena Vasquez. She's been managing our financial operations for the past 3 months. She has something to show you." He stepped aside. Elena stood at the head of the table. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She looked at the 5 faces staring at her. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. An eternity of silence that felt like falling. And then Elena remembered something Dominic had told her during one of their afternoon conversations. Not about business or numbers or strategy, but about fear. "Fear is just energy without direction," he had said. "The same chemicals that make you want to run are the same ones that make you powerful. The only difference is what you do with them." Elena closed her eyes. She took 1 breath. She opened her eyes. "In the past 3 months," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it did not shake, "I've identified approximately $12 million in financial inefficiencies across our 5 primary operations. Half of that is structural, systems that were designed 30 years ago for an organization that no longer exists. The other half is human, individuals who have been either careless or deliberately misallocating funds. I've built a new framework that addresses both problems. It will save this organization approximately $8 million in the first year and significantly reduce exposure to external scrutiny. Here's how." For the next 40 minutes, Elena Vasquez did something she had never done before. She talked. Not in whispers, not in fragments, not with her eyes on the floor. She stood at the head of that table and laid out her plan with a clarity and precision that left no room for confusion and no space for dismissal. She used charts she had prepared herself. She referenced specific numbers from memory. She anticipated objections before they were raised and addressed them preemptively. And the room listened. Not because she was loud, not because she was commanding in the traditional sense, but because everything she said was irrefutable. Every number checked out. Every connection was logical. Every solution was elegant. She had done the work. Months of meticulous, exhaustive work, and the work spoke for itself. When she finished, there was silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that follows something impressive when people need a moment to adjust their understanding of what they just witnessed. The oldest man at the table, a white-haired gentleman named Salvatore Ferrante, who had been with Dominic since the very beginning, was the first to speak. "Where did you find her, Dom?" he asked without taking his eyes off Eleanor. "She found herself," Dominic said. "I just opened the door." Salvatore looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the gravity of a man who had seen many things in his life and still recognized something rare when it appeared. "She stays," he said. And that was that. The weeks following Elena's presentation were a period of rapid and disorienting change. Dominic formalized her role within the organization, giving her a title, Director of Financial Strategy, and an office of her own on the 32nd floor, 3 doors down from his. The office had a window that faced east, and every morning sunlight flooded in with a warmth that Eleanor found herself looking forward to, as though the sun itself was acknowledging her new position in the world. Her responsibilities expanded exponentially. She was no longer just organizing numbers. She was making decisions about where money should go, how resources should be allocated, which investments were sound and which were reckless. She attended meetings not as an observer, but as a participant, and increasingly as the person whose opinion carried the most weight. This did not happen without resistance. Vincent Caruso, Dominic's right-hand man, had made his feelings about Elena clear from the beginning. He did not trust her. He did not think she belonged. And as her influence grew, his opposition intensified. Vincent was not a fool. He was, in fact, deeply intelligent, a strategic thinker who had spent 30 years navigating the complicated politics of Dominic's world. He had risen through the ranks, not through force but through loyalty, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they materialized. He had been Dominic's most trusted advisor for as long as anyone could remember. And now, in a matter of months, a woman he had never heard of was being given access to things that had taken him decades to earn. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was something more complicated. Vincent had built his entire life around a certain understanding of how things worked. Who was inside, who was outside, who could be trusted, who couldn't. Elena Vasquez didn't fit into any of his categories. She wasn't a family member. She wasn't a long-term associate. She wasn't someone who had proven her loyalty through years of service. She was a stranger who had appeared from nowhere and was now sitting in meetings where the most sensitive information was discussed. Vincent's concern was not irrational. In his world, trust was not given freely. It was earned through time and tested through adversity. Eleanor had done neither, and the speed with which Dominic had embraced her made Vincent uneasy in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He began to watch her. Not overtly, Vincent was too sophisticated for that, but he paid attention. He noted when she arrived and when she left. He observed who she talked to and what she said. He looked for cracks in her composure, signs of deception, anything that would confirm his suspicion that she was not what she appeared to be. He found nothing, and somehow that made him more suspicious. The first real confrontation came 6 weeks after Elena's presentation to the operations heads. Dominic had asked Elena to restructure the financial relationship between two of his construction companies, a complex task that involved redirecting funds through a series of legitimate business accounts in a way that would reduce the organization's overall exposure to regulatory scrutiny. It was delicate work, the kind that required absolute precision and absolute discretion. Elena had completed the restructuring in 4 days. She presented it to Dominic on a Thursday morning. He reviewed it, approved it, and instructed her to implement it by the following week. Vincent was in the room when this happened. He said nothing during the meeting, but afterward, he followed Dominic into his office and closed the door. "You're giving her operational authority now?" Vincent said. His voice was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed his agitation. "She earned it," Dominic said. "She's been here 4 months, Dom. 4 months. And you're letting her restructure the financial backbone of 2 of our most sensitive operations. Based on what? Some spreadsheets? Based on the fact that her work is flawless. Based on the fact that she identified problems that none of my people, including you, Vincent, caught in 30 years. Based on the fact that everything she's touched has improved. And what happens when she decides to take everything she knows and walk out the door? What happens when someone offers her more money or threatens her, or when she simply decides she doesn't want to live like this anymore? You've given her the keys to the entire kingdom, and she has no reason to stay." Dominic looked at his old friend for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "I understand your concern. I do. You've protected me for 30 years, and I trust your instincts. But in this case, Vincent, your instincts are wrong. Elena is not a threat. She's an asset, the most valuable one we've ever had. And if I have to choose between your comfort and her potential, I'm going to choose her potential every time." Vincent's expression didn't change. He nodded once, stiffly, and left the room. But the conversation had drawn a line in the sand, and both men knew it. Eleanor, of course, knew none of this. She was aware that Vincent didn't like her. You didn't need her observational skills to see that. He never addressed her directly if he could avoid it. He never acknowledged her contributions in meetings. When she entered a room, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a person's body tenses when they encounter something they perceive as unwelcome. She didn't confront him about it. Confrontation was still something that sat uncomfortably in her chest, like a garment that didn't quite fit. Instead, she did what she had always done. She observed, she noted, and she continued to do her work with a thoroughness that left no room for legitimate criticism. But Vincent's hostility weighed on her, not because she needed his approval, she had spent a lifetime without anyone's approval and had survived, but because it introduced an element of instability into the environment she was trying to navigate. It was like a number that didn't add up in an otherwise balanced ledger. It nagged at her. It demanded attention. The situation escalated in a way Elena did not expect. It happened at a dinner, one of Dominic's quarterly gatherings, held at a private venue in Midtown Manhattan, where the most senior members of his organization came together for an evening of food, conversation, and the kind of subtle political maneuvering that happens whenever powerful people share a room. This was Elena's first dinner. Dominic had told her it was important for her to attend, to be seen, to begin building relationships with the people she would be working with for the foreseeable future. "You don't have to give any speeches," he said with a slight smile. "Just be there. Let them see you. Let them talk to you. You'll be surprised how much ground you can cover just by being present." Elena arrived at the venue, a private dining room in a restaurant whose name she would later forget, and was immediately struck by the atmosphere. It was warm, crowded, and loud. About 40 people filled the space, all of them well-dressed, all of them talking at once. Laughter and the clink of glasses created a wall of sound that made Elena's skin prickle. She found a corner. Of course she did. She took a glass of water from a passing tray and positioned herself near a bookshelf, where she could see the entire room without being in the center of it. She watched. She observed. She catalogued. She noticed that Salvatore Ferrante, the oldest of the operations heads, was holding court at a table near the window, telling a story that involved elaborate hand gestures and frequent pauses for dramatic effect. She noticed that a young woman in a red dress, someone she didn't recognize, was moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a person who was accustomed to being watched. She noticed that Thomas, the driver, was standing by the exit with his arms folded, scanning the room with the same quiet vigilance he brought to everything, and she noticed Vincent Caruso watching her from across the room. Their eyes met for a moment. Vincent's expression was unreadable. Then he turned away and joined a conversation at the bar. 20 minutes passed. Eleanor was considering leaving. She had been there long enough to satisfy Dominic's request, and the noise was beginning to feel oppressive when someone approached her. A man she had seen in meetings, but never spoken to directly. His name was Marco De Luca, mid-40s, handsome in a sharp-featured way, with an easy smile that seemed to come naturally. "You're Elena," he said, not a question. "Yes." "I'm Marco. I run the real estate division. We haven't met properly, but I've heard a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," Elena said, and immediately felt foolish for the cliché. But Marco laughed, a genuine laugh, warm and unforced. "Very good things. Dominic talks about you like you're the second coming of, well, someone very good with numbers. He says you see things other people miss." "I just pay attention," Elena said. Marco tilted his head, studying her with an openness that she found disarming. "That's more than most people do in a lifetime," he said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How does someone who pays this much attention end up standing alone in the corner of a party?" The question was not unkind. It was curious and direct, and it caught Elena off guard, because it named the thing she had been doing without making her feel ashamed of it. "Habit," she said. And then, surprising, herself. "I'm better at watching rooms than being in them." "Maybe," Marco said, "or maybe you just haven't found the right room yet." He smiled again and excused himself, leaving Elena standing by the bookshelf with a feeling she couldn't immediately identify. It took her several minutes to recognize it. It was connection, brief, small, fragile, but real. A moment of genuine human contact that had happened not because she had forced it, but because she had allowed it. She was still processing. This when the trouble started. It came in the form of a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Eleanor had left the main dining room to find a restroom. The hallway was quieter, the noise from the party reduced to a muffled hum. She was passing a partially open door, some kind of private office or lounge, when she heard Vincent's voice. "Can't keep going like this. He's lost perspective. The woman has him completely turned around." Another voice, one she didn't recognize. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone needs to remind him how things work. Who's been here, who's earned their place, before he hands everything over to someone who showed up 5 minutes ago and has no loyalty to anyone in this room." "That's a dangerous position to take, Vincent. It's a necessary one. I've given him 30 years. 30 years. And now I'm standing in the same room as a bookkeeper from the Bronx who has more access to our operations than people who have been with us for decades. That's not just careless, it's reckless. And if Dom doesn't see that, then someone else needs to." Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind was perfectly, crystallinely clear. She had heard this kind of talk before, not in the context of organized business, but in the context of her childhood. The tone, the resentment, the sense of entitlement that came from someone who believed their position was being threatened by someone they considered lesser. She understood Vincent in that moment. Not sympathetically, but completely. She understood that his opposition to her was not about trust or security or the good of the organization. It was about power, his power. The power he had built over 30 years and now felt slipping through his fingers because someone new, someone unexpected, had walked through the door and changed the equation. Elena did not confront Vincent. She did not tell Dominic what she had heard. Instead, she went home that night and sat with dust and thought. She thought about power, what it meant, who had it and why. She thought about the fact that all her life she had been powerless, and now, for the first time, she was in a position where people were threatened by her simply because she existed. It was a profound realization, not empowering exactly, more like clarifying, like cleaning a window and suddenly seeing the view that had always been there. And she decided something important. She decided that she was not going to let Vincent Caruso push her out, not because she wanted power and not because she wanted to fight, but because for the first time in her life she was doing something she was genuinely, extraordinarily good at, in a place where her skills actually mattered, and she was not going to give that up because someone else was afraid of what it meant. Right now, pause for a moment. If this story is hitting close to home for you, if you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel like you did not belong, write in the comments, "My silence is not weakness." Let me see how many of you understand what Elena is going through. The tension between Elena and Vincent simmered for several more weeks without boiling over. They coexisted in the office with the cautious distance of two animals sharing a territory they both considered their own. Elena continued her work. Vincent continued his watch, and Dominic, who was not oblivious to the dynamic between them, chose not to intervene, perhaps because he believed it would resolve itself, or perhaps because he wanted to see how Elena would handle it. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Elena was in her office reviewing the quarterly financial reports when her phone rang. It was the front desk. "Ms. Vasquez, there are two gentlemen here who say they're from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They'd like to speak with Mr. Marchetti." Elena's blood went cold, but her voice when she responded was perfectly steady. "Tell them Mr. Marchetti is not available and offer them a seat. I'll be right down." She hung up. She closed her files. She locked her computer. Then she walked to Dominic's office and knocked. Dominic was at his desk, reading. He looked up. "There are federal investigators downstairs asking for you," Eleanor said. Dominic's expression did not change. Not a single muscle in his face moved. He set down his reading material, folded his hands, and looked at her. "How many?" "2. Did they say what it's about?" "No." "Interesting." He paused. "What do you think?" Elena had been thinking about this from the moment the front desk had called. Her mind had already run through a dozen scenarios, cross-referencing them against the financial structures she had built, looking for vulnerabilities. "If this were a serious investigation, they wouldn't come to the front door," she said. "They'd subpoena records. They'd build a case quietly. Coming here, to the office in person, is either preliminary or performative. Either they're fishing for a reaction or someone pointed them in this direction." "Someone," Dominic repeated. He let the word hang in the air. Their eyes met. Eleanor didn't say Vincent's name. She didn't need to. "Go down and talk to them," Dominic said. "Not as my employee, as my representative. Find out what they want, give them nothing, and then come back and tell me exactly what they said and exactly how they said it." Eleanor went. Downstairs. The two federal agents were sitting in the reception area. They were both men, both in their 30s, both wearing the kind of dark suits that were designed to convey authority without standing out. One was tall with sandy hair and an expression of rehearsed friendliness. The other was shorter, with sharp eyes and the stillness of someone who was trained to observe. "Good afternoon," Elena said. "I'm Elena Vasquez, Director of Financial Strategy. How can I help you?" The tall one did the talking. His name was Agent Morrison. His partner was Agent Chen. They were looking into certain financial irregularities connected to a construction project in Queens, one of Dominic's projects. They were hoping to speak with Mr. Marchetti directly, as a courtesy before proceeding with any formal requests. Elena listened. She asked 3 questions, specific, technical questions about the nature of the alleged irregularities. Agent Morrison answered 2 of them and deflected the 3rd, with a vague reference to ongoing investigative matters. "I appreciate you coming in person," Elena said. "I'll relay your request to Mr. Marchetti and have our legal team reach out to arrange a formal meeting at a time that works for everyone. In the meantime, if you have any specific documentation requests, please direct them to our legal department." She handed them a business card. She shook their hands. She showed them to the elevator. Then she went back upstairs and told Dominic everything, not just what they had said, but how they had said it. Morrison was confident but not aggressive. He was testing the waters. Chen was the more dangerous one. He had been watching Elena the entire time with the focus of someone cataloging details for later use. The Queen's project they had mentioned was one that Vincent had been directly involved in overseeing. "They're not building a case against you," Elena said. "They're building a case against the Queen's project specifically. And either they found something on their own or someone gave them a reason to look there." Dominic was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "Pull every financial record associated with the Queen's project. Everything. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning." Eleanor worked through the night. By 6 a.m., she had assembled a complete financial history of the Queen's construction project, going back 5 years. What she found confirmed her suspicion. The irregularities the agents had referenced were real, but they had not been caused by the financial structures Elena had built. They predated her arrival by years. They were buried in the old system, the system that had been in place before Elena had restructured everything. And they were concentrated in a series of transactions that had been authorized by one person, Vincent Caruso. The discovery sat in Elena's stomach like lead, not because it surprised her. On some level, she had suspected something like this for weeks, but because it meant that Vincent's hostility toward her was not just about pride or power. It was about self-preservation. He had been sloppy. He had left trails. And Elena's reorganization of the financial system had inadvertently made those trails visible. Vincent wasn't afraid of Elena because she was new. He was afraid of her because she was good, and her goodness exposed his weakness. Elena presented her findings to Dominic the next morning. She laid everything out with the same precision she brought to every task. The transactions, the dates, the amounts, the authorization codes that traced back to Vincent's accounts. Dominic listened without expression. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the harbor, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. How long? He asked. At least 4 years, Eleanor said. Possibly longer. The older records are harder to trace because the filing system wasn't digital before I arrived. How much? Approximately $2.3 million, spread across multiple accounts and jurisdictions. It wasn't a large amount in the context of overall operations, which is why it went unnoticed, but it was consistent. Monthly transfers, always just below the threshold that would trigger automatic flags. Dominic turned from the window. His face was the oldest Elena had ever seen it. Not angry, tired, profoundly, deeply tired. 30 years, he said. It was not a statement about the money. It was a statement about a friendship, a partnership, a bond that he had believed was unbreakable and that had just been revealed as something less than what he thought. What do you want to do? Elena asked. It was the first time she had asked Dominic that question. Usually he told her what he wanted, and she found a way to make it happen. But this was different. This was not a financial problem. This was a human one. And Elena understood, with the same clarity she brought to numbers, that the answer to this question would define not just Dominic's relationship with Vincent, but the future direction of the entire organization. Dominic sat down heavily in his chair. There was a time, he said slowly, when I would have handled this differently. When I was younger and angrier and less aware of the cost of things. But I'm old now, Elena, and I've learned that the most expensive thing in the world is not money. It's trust. And once it's broken, you can't restructure. You can't file it away in a better system. It's just gone. He looked at her. Bring Vincent in. Elena made the call. Vincent arrived 20 minutes later, entering Dominic's office with the easy confidence of a man who had walked through that door 1,000 times. He nodded at Dominic, glanced at Elena with his usual dismissiveness, and sat down. What's going on? He asked. Dominic said nothing. He simply nodded at Elena. Elena opened the folder on the desk and began to speak. She went through the transactions one by one, calmly, without accusation, without emotion. She laid out the evidence the way she laid out every financial report, clearly, logically, completely. Vincent's face changed as she spoke, not gradually but in stages, like a series of doors closing. First, surprise, then recognition, then something that looked briefly like shame before it was replaced by a hard, defensive blankness. When Elena finished, the room was silent. Vincent looked at Dominic, not at Elena. He didn't acknowledge her at all. It's not what it looks like, he said. Then tell me what it is, Dominic said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. It was necessary. Things came up over the years, expenses that didn't fit into the official budget, people who needed to be taken care of, situations that required flexibility. I didn't take that money for myself, Dom. I used it for the organization, for things that needed to happen, but that couldn't go through normal channels. $2.3 million of flexibility, Dominic said, over 4 years. In the context of what we move, it's a rounding error. It's not about the amount, Vincent. It's about the principle. And you know that. Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at Eleanor for the first time since the meeting began. His eyes were hard, bright with something that was more complex than anger. She did this, he said. Your pet project. Your little bookkeeper from the Bronx. She's been here 5 months, and she's already tearing apart things she doesn't understand. She understands them better than you do, Dominic said. That's the problem, isn't it? Vincent stood. His chair scraped against the floor. I've given you 30 years, Dominic. 30 years of my life. I've been there for every crisis, every decision, every sleepless night. And now you're going to sit there and let this woman, this nobody, question my loyalty based on some spreadsheet? It's not a spreadsheet, Vincent. It's a pattern. And patterns don't have opinions. They don't take sides. They just show what happened. Eleanor sat very still during this exchange. She could feel the weight of the moment. 2 men confronting a truth that had been buried under 30 years of partnership. She understood that she was both the catalyst and the witness, and that both roles required her to be exactly what she was. present, precise, and silent. Vincent turned to her. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. "You think you've won something here, but you don't know what you've walked into. You don't understand the history, the sacrifices, the things that happen to build what you're so casually dismantling with your files and your charts. You're a number cruncher, that's all. And when Dom is done using you, you'll be right back where you started, alone in a room with a cat, counting other people's receipts." The words landed like stones. Elena felt each one. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held Vincent's gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "You're right that I don't know the history," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "I don't know the sacrifices. I don't know what it cost you to build this. And I respect that more than you'll ever believe. But the numbers are the numbers, Vincent. They don't care about history. They don't care about loyalty. They care about accuracy. And right now, the numbers say that something went wrong, and it needs to be addressed. Not because I have anything against you, but because if it isn't addressed, it puts everyone in this room, including you, at risk." Vincent stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, the hardness in his eyes flickered. Something moved behind it, something that might have been recognition or grudging respect, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a secret for too long and was, despite everything, relieved that it was finally in the open. Then the moment passed. Vincent looked at Dominic. "What happens now?" "Now," Dominic said, "you and I have a conversation, alone." He looked at Elena. "Thank you, Elena. That will be all." Elena left the office. She walked to her own office, closed the door, and sat at her desk. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with the aftermath of adrenaline, the physical cost of standing in the middle of a confrontation that every fiber of her being had been trained to avoid. She had done it. She had stood in a room with two of the most powerful men she had ever met, and she had spoken the truth clearly and without apology. And the world had not ended. The room had not collapsed. She had not been dismissed or diminished or made to disappear. She had been heard. The conversation between Dominic and Vincent lasted 2 hours. Elena never learned exactly what was said. But the outcome was clear. Vincent was not removed from the organization. He was restructured, given a reduced role, stripped of financial authority, and placed under the oversight of a new compliance framework that Elena designed. It was a mercy that only someone with Dominic's combination of toughness and compassion would have offered. A way to preserve 30 years of relationship, while acknowledging that the terms of that relationship had irrevocably changed. Vincent accepted the arrangement. He had no choice. But the look he gave Elena when he passed her in the hallway the next day, that look stayed with her for a long time. It was not hatred. It was not anger. It was something more unsettling than either. It was the look of a man who knew he had been outmatched and who was still trying to understand how. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the atmosphere of the 32nd floor. The confrontation with Vincent had been a seismic event, and like all seismic events, it rearranged the landscape. People who had been cautious around Elena became more open. People who had been dismissive became attentive. The word had spread not through any official announcement, but through the informal channels that exist in every organization, that Elena Vasquez had been the one to uncover the irregularities in Vincent's accounts, and that she had presented her findings with a courage and composure that impressed even Dominic. Salvatore Ferrante, the veteran operations head who had pronounced "she stays" at Elena's first presentation, began inviting her to his weekly strategy sessions. Marco, De Luca, the real estate chief who had spoken to her at the dinner party, became something like a friend, or at least the closest thing Elena had to one. He would stop by her office with coffee, tell her stories about the early days of the organization, and listen when she talked about the patterns she was seeing in the data. "You're different from anyone else here," Marco told her one afternoon. "Everyone else is trying to be seen, you're trying to see, and you end up being seen more than any of them." Elena didn't know what to do with this observation. She was still getting used to the idea that people were paying attention to her, that her presence in a room was noticed, that her absence was remarked upon, that her opinions were sought and valued. It was like learning to walk in a new kind of gravity, where the rules she had built her life around no longer applied. She was also dealing with something she hadn't anticipated: the emotional toll of visibility. Being invisible had been lonely, but it had also been safe. No one could hurt what they couldn't see. Now she was exposed, she was known, and with that came a vulnerability that she found both exhilarating and terrifying. There were nights when she went home to her apartment, still the same tiny studio, though Dominic had offered to help her relocate, and sat with dust and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The responsibility, the expectations, the constant exhausting effort of being present in a world that she had spent 30 years trying to avoid. But there were also mornings when she woke up and felt something she had never felt before. Not confidence exactly, more like alignment, as though the person she was becoming was the person she had always been meant to be, and the years of silence and invisibility had been not a prison, but a cocoon. She was changing. She knew it. Everyone around her knew it. And the most remarkable thing about the change was that it wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about becoming more completely herself. 6 months after Elena Vasquez had walked into Marchetti's restaurant on Arthur Avenue, she sat in Dominic's conference room and delivered a presentation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the organization's future. The presentation was not about past irregularities or current operations. It was about what came next. Elena had spent the past several weeks developing a comprehensive strategy for transitioning the organization's financial activities into entirely legitimate channels. She had identified legal investment opportunities, real estate acquisitions, technology ventures, and philanthropic initiatives that would not only generate substantial revenue, but would do so within the boundaries of the law. It was ambitious, it was detailed, and it was, in Dominic's words, the most forward-thinking proposal anyone has ever put in front of me. The meeting included all 5 operations heads, plus Marco, plus several other senior members of the organization. Elena stood at the head of the table, the same table where she had given her first halting presentation 6 months earlier, and spoke for an hour and a half without notes. She was not the same woman who had stood in that room the first time. Her voice was stronger, not louder, she would never be loud, but clearer, more certain, carrying the weight of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Her posture was different too. She no longer hunched. She no longer tried to take up less space. She stood straight, her feet planted, her eyes moving around the table with the same attention she had once reserved only for columns of numbers. And the room listened, not because Dominic told them to, not because they were being polite, but because Elena Vasquez had become the kind of person whose words carried inherent authority, the authority that comes from competence, consistency, and courage. When she finished, Salvatore Ferrante was the first to speak again, but this time he didn't address Dominic. He addressed Elena. "When do we start?" he asked. Elena smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was real. And for those who had been watching her transformation over the past 6 months, who had seen her evolve from a ghost who haunted the corners of rooms to a presence that commanded their center, that smile was the most powerful thing in the room. "Immediately," she said. The implementation of Elena's strategy began the following week. It was the most complex project the organization had ever undertaken, involving dozens of simultaneous transactions, legal restructurings, and business formations. Elena managed it all, coordinating with lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and investment advisors, while simultaneously maintaining oversight of the organization's existing financial operations. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. 18-hour days became normal. She ate at her desk. She slept in her office on more than one occasion, curled up on the couch that Dominic had insisted she have, with a blanket that Marco had brought her from a store in Soho. And through it all, she maintained the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined her from the beginning. Every transaction was documented, every decision was supported by data, Every potential risk was identified and mitigated before it could materialize. 3 months into the implementation, the results were already visible. The organization's legitimate revenue streams had increased by 40%. 2 new businesses had been launched, a high-end restaurant in Manhattan and a property management company in Brooklyn, both profitable within their first quarter. The organization's exposure to regulatory scrutiny had been reduced to near zero. Dominic watched all of this with a satisfaction that went deeper than pride. He was not a sentimental man. Decades in his line of work had burned most of the sentimentality out of him, but when he looked at Eleanor, he saw something that moved him in a way he didn't fully understand. He saw possibility, the possibility that a life could be redirected, that talent could be recognized, that a person who had been told explicitly or implicitly that they had nothing to offer could turn out to be the most important person in the room. "I have a question," he said to her one afternoon, sitting in his office as the sun went down over the harbor. "Ask it. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened that envelope?" Elena considered this. She thought about the laundromat, about Gerald's manila envelopes, about dust and her blue notebook and the way the light fell in her tiny apartment at 4 in the afternoon. She thought about the woman she had been, not with contempt, but with tenderness. That woman had survived. That woman had endured. That woman had kept herself intact through decades of invisibility, and that was its own kind of strength. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "but I don't think the question is what would have happened. I think the question is how long I could have kept going the way I was. Because the truth is, Dominic, the woman who walked into your restaurant that night, she wasn't brave. She was desperate. She had spent so long being invisible that she had started to wonder if she actually existed. And when your letter said that someone had noticed, that someone had seen the work I was doing, it wasn't courage that made me come, it was relief." Dominic looked at her for a long time. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 30 years, he said. "That's because most people are afraid to be honest with you." "Are you?" "Not anymore." This exchange marked something important in their relationship. From the beginning, Dominic had been the mentor and Elena the student. He had opened the door. He had provided the opportunity. He had guided her through the unfamiliar territory of his world with patience and precision. But the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer teacher and student. They were partners, not in the business sense, but in the deeper sense. 2 people who recognized something essential in each other and who had, through the alchemy of trust and time, created something that neither of them could have created alone. Dominic's health had been declining for some time. He did not speak about it, and Elena did. Not ask, but she noticed the things he could not hide. The way he moved more slowly in the mornings, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence as though gathering strength. The way his hands, those still and powerful hands, had developed a slight tremor that he covered by keeping them folded on his desk or clasped behind his back. She noticed and she worried, but she also understood that Dominic was a man who had earned the right to handle his own vulnerabilities in his own way. And she respected that. The turning point came on a cold evening in March, almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first walked through the doors of Marchetti's restaurant. She was in her office, finishing the day's reports, when Thomas appeared in her doorway. "Mr. Marchetti would like to see you," he said. There was something in his voice, a gravity that Thomas, for all his professionalism, could not entirely conceal. Elena walked to Dominic's office. He was sitting not at his desk, but in one of the armchairs by the window. The city lights spread out behind him like a constellation brought down to earth. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally ready to set it down. "Sit with me," he said. Eleanor sat in the other armchair. "I'm stepping back," Dominic said. No preamble, no build-up, just the fact, delivered with the same directness that had characterized everything he had ever said to her. Eleanor felt the words land heavy and final. "For how long?" "Permanently. My health is not what it was. And more than that, Elena, I'm tired. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've built something. I've maintained it. and now it's time for someone else to carry it. Elena waited. She knew what was coming. She could feel it the way she could feel a number that was off, a certainty in her chest before the evidence reached her mind. "I'm asking you to take over," Dominic said. "Not as director of financial strategy, as the head of the entire organization, all operations, all decisions, everything." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the city hummed with its million small sounds, indifferent to the enormity of the moment unfolding in this office high above its streets. "I know what you're going to say," Dominic continued. "You're going to say you're not ready. You're going to say you don't have the experience, or the connections, or the temperament. You're going to say that a year is not enough time to prepare for something like this." "Actually," Elena said, "I was going to say yes." Dominic looked at her, and for the second time in the year she had known him, he smiled. A real smile, full, warm, and luminous, with something that looked very much like love. Not romantic love, but the deeper kind. The love of a person who has recognized potential in another and watched it bloom. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that. Because you already knew I was going to say, 'Ah, yes, that's why you asked.'" He laughed, a real laugh too. It filled the office and softened the angles of his face, and for a moment he didn't look old or tired or sick. He looked like a man who had done something right. "You know," he said, "when I found you, I thought I was saving you, but I think in the end you might have saved me." "From what?" "From believing that everything I built would die with me." The transition happened over the next 3 months. Dominic worked with Elena every day, transferring knowledge, introducing her to contacts, walking her through the history and the context and the 1,000 small decisions that had shaped the organization over 4 decades. He was meticulous about it, giving her not just the facts, but the principles behind them, the philosophy, the values. "An organization is not a machine," he told her. "It's a family, a complicated, dysfunctional, maddening family, and the person at the top isn't a CEO. They're a parent. They have to be strong enough to make hard decisions and soft enough to understand why those decisions hurt." Elena listened. She absorbed. She prepared. She also made changes, small ones at first. Adjustments to processes, clarifications of responsibilities, improvements to communication channels, then larger ones. She promoted Marco De Luca to a senior advisory role, recognizing his combination of business acumen and interpersonal skill. She created new positions focused on legal compliance and community engagement. She restructured the reporting lines so that every division had direct access to her, eliminating the layers of hierarchy that had allowed problems like Vincent's to go undetected for years. Speaking of Vincent, his relationship with Elena underwent its own transformation during this period. It did not become warm. It was never going to be warm, but it became, slowly and grudgingly, respectful. Vincent had watched Elena navigate the most challenging year of her life with a composure and competence that he could not deny even if he wanted to, and when she approached him, directly without intermediaries, and asked for his help during the transition, he was, for the first time, genuinely surprised. "Why would you want my help?" he asked. "I've done nothing but oppose you since the day you arrived." "Because you know things I don't," Elena said. "You know the history, the people, the unwritten rules. I can learn the numbers on my own, but I can't learn 30 years of institutional knowledge from a spreadsheet. I need someone who's been here. And whether you like it or not, Vincent, that's you." Vincent stared at her for a long time. Then he shook his head, slowly, with something that might have been admiration. "You're tougher than you look," he said. "Everyone is tougher than they look," Elena said. "Most people just don't get the chance to show it." It was the beginning of an unlikely partnership, not a friendship. They would never be friends, but a working relationship built on mutual recognition of each other's strengths. Vincent brought experience and context. Elena brought vision and precision. Together, they were more effective than either would have been alone. 1 year after Dominic Marchetti had stepped back, Elena Vasquez sat in what had once been his office, now hers, and looked out at the harbor. The sun was going down. The water was gold and copper, and the city's lights were beginning to flicker on, one by one, like stars, emerging from the dark. On her desk was a photograph that had not been there when the office belonged to Dominic. It was a picture of Elena at 7 years old, standing in the doorway of her childhood home, half hidden behind the doorframe, one eye visible, looking at the camera with an expression that was simultaneously fearful and curious. She had found it in a box her mother had sent her, the first contact from her family in over a decade, prompted by a newspaper article about a mysterious woman who had taken over one of the most significant business organizations in the Northeast. Elena looked at that photograph every day, not with sadness, with gratitude, because the girl in that picture, the girl hiding behind the door, afraid to be seen, afraid to be heard, afraid to take up space in a world that seemed designed to shrink her. That girl had survived. She had endured. She had carried her intelligence and her sensitivity and her extraordinary gift for seeing patterns through decades of silence and invisibility, and she had emerged on the other side of it all not broken, but forged. The organization had thrived under her leadership. The legitimate business ventures she had launched were generating more revenue than the old operations ever had. The restaurant in Manhattan had become one of the most sought-after dining experiences in the city. The property management company had expanded to 3 boroughs. A new technology investment fund was outperforming market expectations. More importantly, the organization had changed in character. It was no longer an enterprise that operated in shadows. It was becoming something legitimate, something sustainable, something that could exist in the light without fear. This was Elena's greatest achievement. Not the numbers, not the revenue, not the strategic victories, but the fundamental redirection of an entire organization from darkness toward daylight. She had done this not through force, not through intimidation, not through any of the traditional methods of power. She had done it through clarity, through precision, through the quiet, relentless application of a mind that saw everything and understood that the most powerful thing in any room was not the loudest voice but the truest one. Dominic came to the office once a week. His health had stabilized, not recovered, but stabilized, and he seemed more at peace than Elena had ever seen him. He would sit in the armchair by the window, the same chair where he had asked her to take over, and they would talk. Not about business, or not only about business, about life, about the past, about the strange winding paths that lead people from where they start to where they end up. "Do you know what surprised me most about you?" Dominic asked her one afternoon. "Tell me." "It wasn't your intelligence. I expected that. It wasn't your work ethic. I expected that too. It was your compassion, the way you handled Vincent, the way you treated people who had every reason to expect harshness from you. I gave you power, Elena, and instead of wielding it like a weapon, you used it like a bridge." Elena thought about this. "I think it's because I know what it feels like to be on the other side," she said. "I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to feel like your presence doesn't matter. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to make other people feel differently, to make them feel seen the way you made me feel seen, I would take it. And you have," Dominic said, "every day." There was one more thing that happened during that first year, something that Elena did not plan and did not expect, but that became in many ways the most meaningful chapter of her transformation. She started a foundation. It was not a large one and it was not flashy. It was called the Open Door Foundation, and its mission was simple: to identify individuals with exceptional but unrecognized talent, people who had been overlooked by conventional systems, people who had been told they had nothing to offer, people who had spent their lives being invisible, and to give them opportunities to develop their abilities. Eleanor funded it with a portion of the organization's legitimate profits. She built the program herself, working with educators, psychologists, and business mentors to create a pathway for people who had fallen through the cracks. The foundation's first class included 12 individuals: a single mother with an extraordinary gift for engineering design, a formerly incarcerated young man with a talent for coding, a retired nurse with ideas for healthcare innovation, and 9 others whose stories echoed Elena's own. At the Foundation's inauguration, Elena gave a speech. It was the first time she had spoken publicly, and it was also the first time she told her story. Not all of it, not the parts that needed to stay private, but the essence. The essence of a woman who had been invisible for 3 decades, who had been found by someone who saw what others couldn't, and who had discovered through that recognition a version of herself she never knew existed. "I spent most of my life believing that my quietness was a flaw," she said, standing at a podium in a small auditorium in the Bronx, not far from the laundromat where everything had started. "I believed that my inability to speak up, to stand out, to make noise, meant that I had nothing valuable to offer. I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is that I was measuring myself against the wrong standard. I was comparing my silence to other people's volume, and I was losing. But volume isn't power. Attention isn't influence. And the loudest person in the room is almost never the most important one." She paused, looking out at the audience, the 12 Foundation members, the donors, the friends and supporters who had gathered to witness this moment. "The most important person in the room," she said, "is the one who sees what everyone else misses. The one who listens when everyone else talks, the one who pays attention. And I'm here today to tell you that if you are that person, if you have spent your life in corners, in shadows, in the margins, your time is coming. Because the world needs what you see, the world needs what you know, the world needs your kind of quiet." The applause was loud. Elena, who still did not love loud things, smiled through it. Afterward, Marco De Luca found her by the refreshment table, pouring herself a glass of water. "That was remarkable," he said. "It was terrifying," she said. "Most remarkable things are." They stood together for a moment in comfortable silence. Marco had become one of Elena's closest friends, perhaps her closest. He understood her in a way that few people did, partly because he paid attention, and partly because he had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen not to look away. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Of course. When I first met you at that dinner party, standing alone by the bookshelf, I thought you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen. And I was right. You were lonely. But what I didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that your loneliness wasn't a weakness. It was a laboratory. Everything you are now, everything you've built, everything you've become, it was all being developed in that loneliness, in that silence, in those years of watching and waiting and paying attention while the rest of the world was making noise." Elena looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the sting of tears, not sad tears, but the kind that come when something true is spoken, something you've felt, but never had words for. "Thank you, Marco," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me, that night, before anyone else did." "I didn't see you," Marco said gently. "I just didn't look away." Elena Vasquez went home that evening to her apartment, not the tiny studio. She had finally moved into a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood in Manhattan, with a view of the river and enough space for Dust to have his own sunbeam. She sat on her couch with her cat in her lap and looked at the photograph of her 7-year-old self, half hidden behind the doorframe. She thought about the journey, from that doorway to this one, from the girl who hid to the woman who stood at the center of everything, from invisible to indispensable. She thought about Dominic, who had looked at a frightened bookkeeper and seen an empire builder. About Vincent, who had fought her every step of the way, and in doing so had made her stronger than she would have been without the opposition. About Marco, who had not looked away. About Salvatore, who had said she stays and meant it. About Thomas, who drove her home every night in silence that felt like safety. About Gerald and his laundromat, and the manila envelopes that had been the foundation on which everything else was built. She thought about all the quiet people in the world, the watchers, the observers, the ones who sit in corners and see everything and say nothing because they've been taught that their voices don't matter. She thought about the 12 members of her foundation, each of them carrying a gift they had been told was worthless, each of them on the verge of discovering otherwise. And she thought about the title of a story that was, even now, being told and retold by the people who knew it. The Mafia boss reveals hidden power in a shy woman. She now dominates attention and becomes the center of conversations. That was the headline. That was the shorthand. But the real story, the one that mattered, was both simpler and more complex than any headline could capture. It was the story of a woman who learned that power is not volume, that influence is not noise, that the most revolutionary thing a quiet person can do is not to become loud, but to remain quiet and refuse to be overlooked. It was the story of a woman who discovered that the same qualities that had made her invisible, her sensitivity, her attention to detail, her relentless observation of everything around her, were, in the right context, the most powerful qualities in the room. And it was the story of a man who had spent his life building an empire out of shadows and who, in the twilight of that life, did the most important thing he ever did. He opened a door. Not for himself, for someone else, for someone who had been standing on the other side of that door for 30 years, waiting for permission to walk through. Elena Vasquez was no longer waiting for permission. She was no longer hiding behind door frames. She was no longer invisible. She was the center of every room she entered, not because she demanded it, not because she performed it, but because she had earned it through work and courage and the quiet, relentless refusal to be anything less than what she truly was. And what she truly was, it turned. Hout was extraordinary. The sun went down over the river, dust purred in her lap. The city hummed its endless hum outside her window, and Elena Vasquez, the shy woman from the Bronx who had once measured her life in silence, sat in her living room and felt for the first time that the size of her world finally matched the size of her soul. If you watched until the end, it is because this story found something inside you. Because you, too, know what it means to be quiet in a loud world. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can meet you and know who truly connects with the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It takes 1 second and helps more people find stories like this one. And share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that silence is not weakness. That being quiet does not mean being small. That the most powerful person in any room might be the one who says the least. And if you are not yet subscribe now. Because this channel is for the watchers, the listeners, the ones who see what everyone else misses. This is your space. And there are more stories coming. Stories of quiet people who changed everything. You do not want to miss what comes next. This was the story of Elena Vasquez. And somewhere right now, another Elena is sitting in a corner, waiting. Her story is about to begin.